Hi, good evening, folks. I'm Jay Steinmetz, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Fort Hays State University. And Tiger Media Network has allowed us to do a conversation with Representative Rui Xu, who is the first Asian American representative in the history of the Kansas legislature, and a young representative in our politics and in this state. And I felt it would be a good opportunity for us to have a casual conversation about politics, but mostly the subject of this conversation is politics of the future. Where does Kansas go in the future? And I sort of want to paint a picture, if you will, of the ideal future. What does Kansas look like in its ideal? If we could get the best we could out of politics, if we could do things in this state, at the state level, that you feel is most beneficial to the state and its people and the environment, what does Kansas look like? In a detailed way, what does Kansas look like in the next 20 years or the next 50 years?
Sure. My vision of an ideal Kansas is really thriving, dynamic urban and suburban areas. You know, we have the Kansas City suburbs, we have Wichita, we have good-sized cities here in the state, but my vision also has a really thriving rural Kansas as well. I think traditionally when people talk about rural Kansas, they automatically start thinking pastoral, right, or the downtown, and those are absolutely important, absolutely an essential part of Kansas. But I think we can also think a little bit more ambitiously on what an ideal rural Kansas is. 20 years from now, it might not look like what it looked like in 1960 or 1950 or before. It could look very, very different. It could look more vertical, and I'm really excited to explore those possibilities.
What do you mean by vertical? Can you give some examples of what that might look like?
Yeah, I think in the suburbs, at least in the Kansas City area, it's gotten more and more sprawled. Whereas in the rural areas, I think things are a lot more centralized, and they still do have a downtown that business can thrive around. That's what I envision. I envision a really sprawled, tall, maybe as it grows, downtown areas with kind of supplements around it, but kind of all around this central area.
You know, we're talking about Kansas, but a way of discussing this, we're also talking about Middle America. We're talking broadly about rural America, and the kinds of adjectives like dynamic and progressive are not often attached to what we say rural America or Middle America. But maybe it ought to be. And what does that look like? What does a dynamic and progressive rural America look like to you?
It looks like people who are willing to experiment and push the limits. There are towns in Kansas, in the area, that are doing that and are revitalizing their downtowns and rethinking what it looks like. You know, there can be tech shops in rural Kansas. There can be, you know, every amenity that you might want in urban Kansas, in rural Kansas. You just need to keep people there, and I think that's a big part of this conversation is how do we keep young people here in Kansas?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about your own background and upbringing? How did you get into politics? Where are you from originally? How did you get into politics?
I don't know how I got in politics. I grew up in Switzerland. I was born in Switzerland. My parents were Chinese PhD students there. Honestly, the path to get directly from China to America was pretty slim. And so they thought, you know, we'll go to Switzerland, get our PhDs there, and then hop over to the States. And I grew up in a town that is very, very, very similar to Hays, actually. It's a town called Rolla, Missouri. Nowadays, it's a university town of about 20,000 people. Probably sounds familiar. It had elements of that. But the thing about it is people like me just kept leaving Rolla, you know. And so then I went as far away from Rolla as you could possibly get culturally and physically in the United States probably, and I studied economics at USC out in Los Angeles. But then I started kind of feel a pull to come home, and part of that was my fiance at the time, now wife. She was in Springfield, Missouri, and she wanted to stay in the area. And so I was like, yeah, well, I'll move back after we graduate. So we decided together on Kansas City, which had kind of those dynamic things that young people want. It has a great food culture, great sports culture, great beer culture, candidly. Mm-hmm. And so we moved to the Kansas City area. Once we started thinking about having kids and a family, we moved to the Kansas City suburbs right across the state line, and that's why we chose Kansas for the great public schools. In terms of politics, my journey probably started, like most young people nowadays, with the 2016 election. It was just, we saw in America that me as an immigrant especially, I didn't expect to see. You know, growing up, it was always in fairly inclusive cultures, but especially starting with 2016, you kind of started to see that revolve a little bit, the rhetoric around that a little bit. And so it just kind of made me feel like I needed to do something a little bit more. And so the first moment where I really thought about running for office was probably, I believe it was late 2017 when Doug Jones won the Senate seat in Alabama. And I thought, if we can win seats in Alabama, we can do stuff in Kansas as well. I can fight for Kansas. And so eventually I got connected with some people, and they told me that, you know, you have a incumbent Republican state representative. We can't find a Democrat to run for it. We think you'd be good for it. And I kind of told myself I had to do it. You know, if nobody else is willing to step up and do it, I can do it. I can learn. I'd never made a phone call for any candidate before. I'd never knocked a door for a candidate before. But, you know, I just thought it was important to look back in 30 years and say, hey, when Donald Trump was president, what did you do? And the answer couldn't be nothing. The answer couldn't be, I had some great tweets. You know, I had some great Facebook posts that my friends saw. Had
Some
to be
sick
something.
burns on social media.
Right. It had to be something.
Yeah.
And so I decided to run. And so...
briefly, what were you doing professionally before you, at this time when you were deciding to run?
So I was working at a nonprofit, which I loved, called Children International in the Kansas City area, and they're a kind of an international child sponsorship organization. I was doing marketing for them, and I loved it, and it fulfilled me in a deep way of doing good, right? But politics was a way to, again, another avenue to do good. And honestly, that took a lot of the pressure off of me when I was running. I was like, you know, win or lose, I'm doing good for somebody. That's important. That was important to me. And so really, it was just came about running the best races that I could. One of my favorite metaphors for running a campaign is running for office is kind of like, hey, Jay, do you want to go to the moon? And you're sitting there, you're like, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go to the moon. And they're like, okay, build a spaceship. I'm leaving. And then you're sitting there like, what does a spaceship look like? I don't know. And that spaceship is your campaign. And so you start reading some books and talking to people about what their campaign looked like, what their spaceship looked like. And eventually you start to get an idea in your mind. But my job and why I'm willing to talk like this or speak to any group that invites me is to kind of inspire as many people to do it as possible, to kind of at least give people the blueprint of what that spaceship looks like for them.
Yeah, and you mentioned younger people before.
Yeah.
You know, how do we get younger people involved in running for office or engaged in politics? We did an event here in Hayes for the Ellis County Democrats, and although it was well attended, the demographic definitely skewed a little older. You know, how do you get young people to attend these events, to get involved in politics? What are some of the nuts and bolts of that, in hopes of maybe greasing the path a little bit toward them actually running for office?
I think this is a question that's age-old in politics in general. I think we know the participation rates for young people in politics has always skewed lower than people would like. For me, the answer is just be as present as I can, be as public as I can, talk to as many people as I can, because I have a responsibility now that I am an elected official to show other people the path that they can do it. You know, and so it's not going to happen over time. If people are disengaged, one young representative coming to Hayes is not going to fix it one time. But, you know, if I come once and people get excited about it and spread the word, and maybe next time when spring break is not so close, maybe some more young people come as well. And so it's got to be a repeated effort by other young elected officials in power to show the path to everybody else. And so getting elected young people is a big part of it, and the incentive structure for the Kansas legislature does not allow for a lot of young people to do this.
How so specifically? What are those obstacles?
The day that I won, I had to quit my other full-time job that we had talked about, and I probably took a 75% pay cut personally to do that. And then so that wasn't super doable. We didn't have any kids at the time, which was helpful. And eventually along the way, I picked up 2 freelancing gigs to make up some of the income. But just in the end, we just did our taxes. My taxable income from Kansas was $8,000.
Wow.
Yeah, for the year. And so you get some of that back when you retire as a pension. Great, you know, in 35 years when that becomes relevant to me, but for now, you know, a lot of people have to worry about putting food on their tables, and I'm lucky that my wife has a stable job. She's been very supportive of it, but realistically for young people, there's only so long you could do this before you think about I'm in my prime earning years. How much money am I giving up? That's why you see state legislatures skew so old in a lot of states. That's why they're retirees who've already made their money. They're just kind of maybe trying to tack on to their pension a little bit on the back end, and that's what's important to them.
Or independently wealthy,
or
as we see even at the national level in politics. So many congresspersons in Washington independently wealthy. I think this is a conversation that we often don't have in the public, because there is a large section of the public that has the sentiment that politicians already are given too many benefits, and to scale back the amount of congressional pay, or to limit the kind of. But then you hear also on the other side of the coin, I think there was a Politico article several years ago that some congresspersons are actually sleeping in their offices because the cost of rent in Washington, D.C. is sort of through the roof. So I think a lot of the public doesn't realize that when elected officials it is assumed that they receive too many benefits for public service, for being an elected official. What that does is create an environment in which mostly independently wealthy people are able to run. If we didn't pay public representatives anything, we'd probably have skew an even much more wealthy political class.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just to tack on to that, it's a very unpopular thing to talk about legislator pay. Everybody in the legislature agrees that this is an issue, but the moment that you even mention the word legislative pay, you can imagine the postcards that are coming in your next campaign cycle. And this is something that I'm willing to talk about openly and publicly because somebody has to. And then the only way this works is if enough people do it and both parties agree to essentially a ceasefire to address this issue. And so I'm hoping that by me doing this, more people are in the public realize it's an actual issue in terms of getting good representation, but also other representatives can feel more enabled to talk about it too.
Here's a concern that I've had as a political scientist teaching politics, teaching American government. It's quite clear that the word politician is a dirty word in our current American parlance. How do we have that conversation with the public? How does the public move away from, this is a slightly different but obviously related question to a deep distrust, a growing distrust in government, and a belief that government is always the problem and never the solution, to quote somebody quite famous in American politics. But it's a slightly different issue. How do we get the public to recognize that public service is an important responsibility, and that I've always, there are certainly exceptions to this, but I've always reminded my students in political science classes to take a less cynical view of those who are in political leadership positions in Topeka or Washington or other state capitals, that on the whole, it is safe to assume that most Republicans and most Democrats and most independents who are elected officials genuinely believe that what they're doing is the right thing, and they're trying to genuinely do what it is that either they feel their constituents want them to do or what their ideological commitments inform them to do. How do we get the public to come to that, a more, in my opinion, more balanced view about elected officials?
I think it's to engage in the process. I think you get a very, very quick view on who your elected official is once you reach out to them. I respond to every single email that comes to my way from a constituent. I personally respond to every single one of them because it's that important to me. I respond to every single phone call that comes to me from a constituent because it's that important to me. And I think you just have to elect people that you trust, and you have to test that trust too by reaching out to them. And so I would recommend reaching out to them to see how engaged they are with you, because that's the job, is to represent you. And if they're not responding to emails, then that's part of the job. And related to this, I often think about this job that I'm doing is actually like 4 different jobs in one as well. Politician is probably my least favorite part of it, and I think a lot of our least favorite part of it. We are elected by party. There are party dynamics. There are politics that you have to play. But also, that's part of it. There's the representative part of it, the constituent services, and especially with unemployment so high with the pandemic, that's been a test of our ability to do that. There's the campaigning part of it, just how are you knocking doors? And then there's the legislator part of you, which is how good are you at reading policy? How good are you at making relationships and amending policy too? So it's all these different parts. And then all of that goes into this kind of overall job of politician. But, I think it has to get balanced.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What would you say directly to a young person who would like to be more involved and potentially run for office? What directly would you say to them about your own experiences running for office at the relatively young age that you ultimately decided to throw your hat in the ring?
Mm-hmm. I say, do it. We need you. Honestly, it's a duty, public duty to do it. I firmly believe that better policy gets made when we get a wide representation of people in office, which we do not have now. Again, it skews pretty old. I think the average age in the legislature is probably 66, 67, somewhere in that range. And so I really want you to do it. And it's going to be a sacrifice. It's going to be hard. And it's going to require a lot about you. But you also get rewarded. You learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about the process. And you end up inspiring a lot of people that you don't expect to. I don't know if this comes off, but I am not inherently a huge public rah-rah guy. It does not bring me a lot of joy to go to rallies and speak to crowds. But it's a big responsibility to have people come out and listen to you. And it's your job to listen to them, and it's your job to inspire them to do good as well. And I think that's the role of an elected leader.
You say not such a rah-rah public voice. Do you think that there's a problem in politics with too much theater, with too much attention that the public pays on electoral politics, and not enough attention on the sort of nitty-gritty lawmaking side of things, the governing side of politics, that the sexy show, if you will, of electoral politics attracts certain spectatorial figures, or figures that are comfortable in the spectacle?
Who could you be talking about? Yeah, absolutely. And this is definitely wrapped up in this 24-hour media cycle where conflict rules the day, and ultimately, in the end, politics becomes sports. We have two parties and they're fighting for power, and every day goes back and forth. Absolutely, that's part of the spectacle. I've often thought a lot about, too, is that our deciding mechanism for who we elect is very different than the actual job, right? Like, as I alluded to earlier, this is like a job interview. And so extroverts always win, right? If you have an extrovert who's well-spoken versus an introvert who is very smart but maybe not as quite as public, they're not going to come off as well. And so the deciding mechanism is very different than the job, which is literally reading through lines of policy, right? And that, in my opinion, very, very well suited for an introvert's job. And so when I take the test, I tend to fall pretty much in the middle, which I think it makes sense, and which is why I like doing both of those things, or I'm comfortable doing both of those things. But for a lot of the jobs, I think we need more introverts in politics, other than just, the staff and researchers and revisers. I think we need thoughtful introverts in positions of power as well.
How?
It's a good question. I think a lot of it is people doing better research. And there are introverts in the legislature too, they just have to take longer naps, or they go home earlier. But we just have to inspire them that they can do it too. If we get more young people, if we get more introverts elected in office, that to a certain extent will inspire other people to think they can do it too.
There's always this dynamic about public problems of governance, social problems, of where solutions lie, either bottom up organically from public awareness, if you will, or top down. What are things that current elected officials can do to reform the system? In teaching the history of the American Republic as a political scientist, I like to have that conversation about the distinction between a republic and a democracy, because I have heard quite a bit from some folks, tend to skew a little bit more conservative and Republican, say that the United States of America is not a democracy, it's a republic. This is a false debate, of course, from the framers and founders' perspective. A republic very much was a democracy, and the only distinction that one might draw is that a republic is an enlightened democracy. And that's to suggest that a well-informed public is an essential bedrock condition of good democratic governance. And you know, there lies, I think, part of looking at the messy middle between not bottom up and top down, but how they can inform one another and reinforce one another. How do we bring about a better, more enlightened society, a more informed society? This is such a crucial question with so many different avenues to it. We live in a world of increasing disinformation and misinformation. We live in a world of increasing distrust of pretty much all forms of authority. As I say, it's almost a full-blown ideology now, a distrust in authority. Medical authority, news, journalism, government authority. How do we push back from this storm that we are in and facilitate a more well-informed society, a more enlightened society?
Yeah, this is a very recent, a lot of this is a very recent phenomenon, right? We have very bifurcated media environments, right? You can find whatever news source that you want that backs up what you want to believe, whether that's news media, TV media, or on the internet especially, that's true. I don't have a good answer because the obvious answer is going to be some sort of censorship, and I don't want that, right? You can't test the First Amendment in that way. But I do think that there was a benefit back when there were only like 4 news channels to choose from, and they had to kind of play that middle and just give you the bare bones news. Right now, that's not what the media environment looks like, and so people can go out to any number of sources and find their truth, if you will. And so I don't have a good answer. It is a problem, and it is a problem that politics has yet to solve in the modern day.
It's a really difficult problem, you know, and it could potentially one answer be in something like antitrust legislation. We've had a very recent, long stretch of American political history with a profound distaste for anything antitrust. Are there potential avenues in that respect? We have a proliferation of seeming lots of different voices in the digital information sphere, but we also have a high degree of concentration amongst media conglomerates. Is a potential there for antitrust to be part of a solution?
It could be, but I can see the appeal of that, but also we've seen that when one social media giant, for example, breaks down, people just kind of scatter into a bunch of different other groups too. So I don't know. I can see that leading to just other problems. I don't see an obvious solution to this problem. If there was, I'm sure somebody would have done it by now.
Yeah. I think some of the harder solutions come from education. Comes from a commitment to education, a commitment to media literacy, and that. I think so many of the problems that we have that are public and shared problems are problems that there is at least some component to that's about education. And this is a state, Kansas, which is a strong conservative state, but also a state which you look at the polls, a great many Kansans consider education to be one of the most important issues.
Yes.
Where do we need to go? Let's go back to that Kansas in 20 years, Kansas in 50 years. You talked about this age-old problem in politics that the younger generation doesn't feel connected and invested. But yet it's the younger generation who's more likely to think intergenerationally, more likely to think about posterity and the future and the deeper future. What does Kansas look like in 20 or 50-year period of time with regards to education?
It depends on who keeps winning elections for the next 10 years. You know, I think we have a Republican Party right now who continuously fights against public education funding, be it K through 12 or be it higher education funding. And if these people continue to make waves like they did in 2020, they made gains, then we're going to see a degradation of our public education system in Kansas. There are lots of Republicans out there that support public education. Many of them lost in 2020. There are many Democrats that support that. Many of them lost, some won in 2020. So this comes down to elections. And if you look at the next 20, 50 years, the quality of our education is going to come down to who wins.
And if the elections are there, if gains can be made for those who support high quality public education, where do you hope to see it? I mean, what does it look like concretely for someone who has children? Me, myself, I have children. I'm worried about this. And I think about where is education, or what is it going to look like in the future? And what directions will it go to enable, again, a society that is well-informed, bedrock condition of democracy?
Yeah, I think some form of seeking real truth that has to start to be considered in the curriculum. I think that, again, the media environment is so fractured that you don't know how to find the truth, the actual real truth, and I think that has to be part of the curriculum. I think also, too, is people are doing this already, mostly the younger generation, my experience, but just general goodness, how to do good in the world. I think we are focused right now a lot on tests, and that's fine, and I have no problem with that. But I think that there's a broader conversation to go out in the world and do good and see what that does for people. And I think that in and of itself will do a lot to help engage the young people in politics too. That's an avenue to do good, as I've talked about. And so, you know, whatever we can do to encourage our kids to do that, I think the world will benefit from that.
Yeah, our slogan in Department of Political Science here at Fort Hays is political thinking for the greater good. And when you phrase it that way, and when you start thinking politically about the greater good and the common good, it opens up lots of different possibilities for engaging in political thought as a way toward action, as a way toward volunteering, being part of a community, making connections to the community, doing things with your thoughts about where society ought to go, what are the solutions to some of the public problems. It reminds me a little bit too of, well, Finland was just in the news recently because they were #1 again as the happiest nation, despite the fact that the COVID pandemic probably doesn't make living in very cold climates very enjoyable.
Sure.
But Finland is also consistently #1 in terms of some of the best educated societies in the world. And I've read a little bit about the unique Finnish education. So much of it is getting away from standardized tests and getting kids actually outside. Environmental learning is a big part of Finnish education. For example, I saw this assignment that students had to, with a compass, go out into the forest and get lost and then try to find their way out.
Right.
And these kinds of tactile, hands-on, educative experiences, how do we bring about some of that into our public education system in Kansas? How do we, and this is a question that connects to what you were talking about before in our visit, which is to think of the ways in which Kansas can be a leader. Instead of seeing Kansas at number 47 and 48 and 49 on the list of so many different things, but to be a leader, how can we go about doing that in our public education system?
Well, in our Constitution, the curriculum is all given to the State Board of Education, so I would absolutely recommend reaching out to them and seeing their thoughts on that. I would be totally willing personally to re-examine our curriculum and how we determine what success is for our students, what a happy, do we want the highest test scores or do we want the happiest students? Those are very, very different things to design a curriculum around. So I would absolutely ask your Board of Education member, and then if the answer is not to your satisfaction, there are elections coming up, and kind of on a more broad sense, Finland also has healthcare. They also have access to higher education for free, and then those are things that are not true here in the United States that I think, yes, you pay higher taxes for it, acknowledged, right? But if I don't have to worry, how much is my daughter, her name's Astra, how much is Astra's college going to cost in 17 years? Like it could be, what, $100,000 a year at that point, it could be $80,000 a year at that point. So taking that particular mental load off your brain, I think contributes a lot to happiness.
We're almost out of time, and there's so many issues to cover, and we really didn't get very far, just scratching the surface. But very quickly, climate change, the environment. How does Kansas become a leader in climate change? There seems to be a lot of natural resources here in this state where we can find alternative pathways and be a leader on this issue from here in the middle of the country. Thoughts on that? Yeah,
I genuinely think that Kansas can and should be the leader in renewable energy in this country. We have a lot of wind, we have a lot of sun, and we don't have that many people, which means that in my opinion, we can, again, and should be the first state to go 100% renewable. and sell renewable energy to other states. Now that requires planning. We need a state energy plan, and that requires ambition. I've been on the record, and you've heard me say before, I'm tired of Kansas being 47th in this country, 48th in the country. I want to be first. I want to be a leader. But we need leaders who are driven and strategic and ambitious on this.
I think a lot of that might come from the younger generation.
Yes.
Well, it's a great conversation to have. I really appreciate you coming out here to Hays. Again, I'm Jay Steinmetz, and this is Representative Rui Xu here, who has visited us in Hays, talking about the future of Kansas and what it may look like. Thank you for joining us. It was a real pleasure. So long.